The Parish Ledger of Vanishing Names. A Miss Marple Mystery. The ledger was old enough that no one thought to question it. It had sat in the vestry of St. Edmund's for 130 years, give or take, wrapped in a length of oilcloth, when the roof leaked and placed on the highest shelf during the flood of 1947. It was bound in dark leather that had gone the colour of dried mud, and it smelled of both those things, leather and mud and something older, something that had nothing to do with either. The entries inside were in half a dozen different hands depending on the decade, some crabbed and difficult, some looping and ornate, and some, the most recent 40 years, in the small, careful script of Mr. Aubrey Pemberton, who had been verger at St. Edmund's since 1958, and who had died in his sleep on a foggy Tuesday in October at the age of 79. The village mourned him adequately. Mrs. Garvey at the post office said he'd been a fixture, which was true. The women of the flower rota said he'd always made sure the vases were topped up before Sunday, which was also true, and which nobody else had ever bothered to do. His widow, Nora, received a great number of covered dishes and declined most visitors, which the village found understandable. He'd been a quiet man, the sort of man you noticed mostly when he wasn't there. Reverend Cloak had been at St. Edmund's for 4 months. He was 31, and had come from a parish in Swindon, and had found Lower Wellbury somewhat bewildering, in the way that young men sometimes find places where nothing appears to happen. But he had delivered the funeral sermon with genuine feeling, having known Mr. Pemberton only slightly, but having read enough of the ledger by then, that quiet record of hatches, matches, and dispatches, to feel that he understood the shape of the man's life. He went back to the ledger 3 days after the funeral. He wasn't sure later what made him look more carefully. Possibly it was the detail that Mr. Pemberton had apparently re-inked certain entries over the years, small corrections here and there, and that it seemed like the proper thing for a new custodian to understand what had been done before him. He sat at the vestry table on a Thursday afternoon, with the ledger open and the rain coming down steadily outside, and turned the pages with the careful attention that his bishop would have found admirable had he been there to see it. He found the first erasure on page 312. It wasn't obvious. That was the thing. The ink was gone, properly gone, and someone had taken trouble to match the surrounding colour of the page so that a casual glance showed nothing wrong at all. But the light came in low from the vestry window at that hour, and Reverend Cloak happened to tilt the page slightly, and there it was, the ghost of writing. Indentations in the paper where a pen had pressed, the physical memory of words that no longer existed. A name and a date and something after that he couldn't make out. He sat very still for a moment. Then he turned more pages, looking differently now, tilting the ledger toward the window. He found 5 more before the light failed. 6 in total, spanning what looked like the last 40 years. All careful, all thorough. Is all, leaving nothing but those faint impressions in the paper.
We began our story in the dusty vestry of St. Edmund's. It is a habit of youth to overlook the quiet ones, but over the decades we learn that those who stand in the shadows often see the most. The new, young Reverend Cloak took over the parish. Conscientious and earnest, but the light caught the page at just the right angle. 6 names, 6 entire lives. They say time heals all wounds and that the past fades, but we know better. Some call it opportunism when a man gathers the misfortunes of others, but I call it Patience. The young Reverend brought this troubling discovery to my dear friend Dolly Bantry.
Like the marks a child leaves when they write too hard on the top sheet and forget about the one beneath. He told Mrs. Bantry about it at tea on Friday because she'd asked how he was settling in, and he'd found himself telling her before he'd thought to decide whether he should. Dolly Bantry had been coming to Lower Wellbury every autumn for 11 years, ever since a school friend of hers had bought the old farmhouse on the Minton Road and issued a standing invitation. She was a woman of considerable resilience. She'd had to be, after everything with Arthur, and she had a fondness for the village that was entirely undiminished by the fact that it was, to be perfectly honest, rather dull. She liked the church. She liked the walk along the mill pond. She liked Mrs. Garvey, who was one of those postmistresses who functions as a sort of informal newspaper for the community, and who could tell you, if you asked correctly, a great deal about any family in the parish going back 2 generations. Miss Marple had arrived the previous Sunday. She was visiting Dolly at Dolly's invitation, having mentioned in a letter that October was sometimes difficult for her joints, and that the drive from St. Mary Mead to Lower Wellbury was quite manageable if one's nephew arranged it, which he had. She was 74, or 76, or somewhere in that vicinity, and she had brought more wool than anyone could reasonably use in a fortnight, and a great capacity for being interested in things that other people found unremarkable. Dolly had told her about the erasures on Friday evening, and having heard about them from Reverend Cloak at tea. 6 names, she said, all gone. He only found them because the light was low. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. She was counting stitches. Did he say, she said eventually, which years the entries were from? 1960-something, I think, and 1 from the 70s, and at least 2 from more recently. Why? Only curious. A pause. Has anyone mentioned a woman named Roach? Ellen Roach, I think. Dolly, you may have to remind me. You mentioned her when you telephoned last month. Something about the mill pond. Dolly set down her cup. Good Lord, you remember everything. Only things that catch. She drowned. 1952. They said it was an accident. She went in off the far bank on a winter evening, and by the time anyone found her, it was too late. And she'd been living in the village about 2 years, come down from somewhere in Yorkshire. Widow, I think, or, well, I'm not entirely sure what she was. No family that came forward. And her name is one of those erased? Reverend Cloak thinks so. He couldn't make out all of them, but the date was right, and the first letter seemed to be an R. Miss Marple nodded, as though this confirmed something she'd suspected but hadn't yet articulated. Outside, the fog had come in off the fields and was pressing itself against the windows. Somewhere down the lane, a dog was barking at something that probably wasn't there. Who was the verger before Mr. Pemberton? Miss Marple asked. An old man called Fitch. Died in 1956. He'd been verger since before the war. So Mr. Pemberton would have inherited the ledger? I suppose so, yes. He took over the position in, Reverend Cloak said 1958, I think. Miss Marple was quiet again. Her needles clicked. She was making something grey and practical that was either a cardigan or a very large scarf, and the clicking had a way of sounding like thought. I'd like to go to Sunday service, she said at last, if you don't mind. Dolly said she didn't mind at all, which was the truth. She was also reasonably sure that Miss Marple's interest in Sunday service had rather less to do with Reverend Cloak's sermon than with who else might be sitting in those pews and what their faces might do when certain things were mentioned. But she had known Miss Marple long enough not to say so. Lower Wellbury on a Saturday morning was the kind of thing people mean when they say they miss the England of their childhoods, though it's worth noting that not everyone's childhood looked like this. The High Street had a butcher, a bakery, a post office, and Hartwells, which sold haberdashery and wool and certain household goods, and which had been run by the same family since 1903. There was a pub called the Crossed Keys that served a decent ploughman's and an indifferent pint. There was a solicitor's office with a brass plate on the door reading Hadley and Sons, which had been Hadley and Sons since the son in question had died in 1941 and had never been updated, because Mr. Hadley, who was now 67 and ran the practice alone, found it too melancholy to change. There was the mill pond. It sat at the bottom of the lane that ran past the church, and you could see it from the churchyard wall if you stood at the far end by the older graves. It was about 30 yards across, and had a surface that on calm days looked completely solid, grey-green and still, and on windy days came alive in a way that was slightly unpleasant if you were thinking about 1952. There was no fence on the far bank. There had never been a fence on the far bank, even after what happened to Ellen Roach. Miss Marple stood at the churchyard wall on Saturday afternoon and looked at it for a while. She had walked down from the farmhouse alone, having told Dolly she fancied the air, which was true enough. The fog had lifted, but left everything damp. The yew trees dripped. The older headstones had that fur of green-black moss that made them look like they were slowly being absorbed back into the ground, which, in a way, they were. She read a few of the stones near the wall. At some she recognized as names Dolly had mentioned. Fitch, the old verger, there he was, 1882 to 1957, faithful in all things. Several Hartwells going back to 1841. A scattering of more recent names. No Roach anywhere. She'd half expected that, though she wasn't yet sure what she'd do with it. She turned and looked back at the church. The vestry window was visible from here, small and high, the one Reverend Cloak had mentioned. On a clear afternoon in October, with the sun already falling low, the light would come in at just that angle. She thought about the ledger. She thought about Fitch, who had died in 1956, and Pemberton, who had taken over in 1958, and Ellen Roach, who had drowned in 1952, and whose entry someone had carefully removed from the record, leaving only the ghost of her name pressed into the paper, like a regret that wouldn't quite go away. She thought about a man in St. Mary Mead years ago, a gardener named Tot who had kept other people's secrets in a little brown book and had been found, in the end, to have been collecting something rather more valuable than references.
Welcome back, my dears. As we untangle the threads of Lower Wellbury, I am reminded of how the past never truly leaves us. I wandered through the old churchyard. I saw the graves of the Hartwells and of old Mr. Fitch. Reverend Cloak only saw those erased names because the afternoon sun hit the page at a low angle. It made me think of a gardener I once knew who kept his neighbour's worst moments written in a little brown book. We must always be wary of the quiet ones who simply watch and wait. With this grim picture forming in my mind, I knew exactly where I had to look next. But as is so often the case when secrets begin to unravel, time was not on our side.
The police inspector at the time had called it opportunism. Miss Marple had called it patience. which she thought was more accurate and considerably more frightening. Then she walked back up the lane to tell Dolly she'd like to meet the solicitor. Sunday at St. Edmund's drew about 40 people, which Reverend Cloak had been told was respectable for a village this size, and which he was beginning to believe, though he still found the silences between hymns longer than he was used to. Miss Marple sat in the third pew on the left, next to Dolly. She wore her good blue coat and had brought her bag, which contained wool and needles and a small notebook that she had not mentioned to anyone. She sang the hymns in a thin, true soprano that surprised the woman in front of her, who had expected, on no particular evidence, that old ladies from St. Mary Mead would be uncertain about their pitch. She spent the sermon watching the congregation. Not obviously, she appeared to anyone who glanced back to be paying the closest attention to Reverend Cloak's thoughts on the parable of the talents, which were earnest and not poorly organized. But her eyes moved. She had learned, a long time ago, that the easiest way to watch people was to look as though you were watching something else entirely. Nora Pemberton was in the front row, and as a widow of 3 weeks had every right to be. She was a small woman, somewhere in her mid-60s, with the kind of face that had once been pretty, and now was just careful. She wore black, which was correct, and she held her hymn book with both hands, which was either grief or habit, and she had on a brooch at her collar that caught the light from the east window and threw a small bright point across the pew in front of her. Miss Marple looked at the brooch for a moment. Then she looked at the rest of the congregation. The Hartwells, 3 generations of them by the look of it, the grandfather in his 80s, and a pair of grandchildren who were being managed in whispers by their mother. A red-faced farmer near the back who fell asleep briefly during the second reading, and woke when his wife put her elbow into his ribs. Several people she didn't know yet. And, near the door, as though she'd arrived late and hadn't fully committed to being there, Mrs. Garvey from the post office. The name came up in the notices. Reverend Cloak, winding toward the end of the service, mentioned that the parish records were undergoing a review, and that if any parishioners had questions about entries relating to their families, they were welcome to speak with him after the service or during the week. He said it in the tone of someone who has been advised to say something in a particular way, and is trying to honour that advice. Most of the congregation received this with the mild interest people give to administrative announcements. Mrs. Garvey's hands tightened on her order of service. It was a small thing. A slight whitening of the knuckles, a fractional shift in posture, and a jaw that went from relaxed to not relaxed in the space of a second and a half. Then it was over, and she looked the same as before. But Miss Marple had been watching the door, and Mrs. Garvey was beside the door, and Miss Marple had very good peripheral vision for a woman of her age. After the service, there was tea in the church hall, which was attached to the east end of the building by a covered walkway that let in a considerable amount of wind. The tea was strong and came in large brown pots that suggested it had been brewing since before the second hymn. Miss Marple took a cup and found a chair near the wall and waited for people to come to her, which they did because Dolly introduced her to everyone within reach. And Dolly's introductions tended to be thorough. She met the Hartwells. She met the farmer, and who was called Beach, and who was friendlier awake than he'd appeared asleep. She met 2 sisters named Poole, who had lived in the village their entire lives, and who carried, between them, what seemed to be a complete record of every piece of social information Lower Wellbury had generated since approximately 1960. She did not meet Mrs. Garvey, who had left before the tea. She did meet Nora Pemberton, briefly. Dolly brought her over with the careful handling one uses with the recently bereaved, and Nora shook Miss Marple's hand and said she hoped she was enjoying her visit, and Miss Marple said she was very much. And they exchanged a few words about the weather and about how difficult October could be, which was true in more than one sense. Up close, the brooch was a spray of small dark blue stones in an old silver setting, and the kind of thing that would have looked at home in a jeweller's window on a city street. Not antique exactly, 20 years old perhaps, or 25, but not cheap. Not Verger's wife cheap, if Miss Marple was being honest with herself, which she generally was. "Your husband will be greatly missed," Miss Marple said. Nora Pemberton's expression did something complicated that resolved itself into a smile. "He devoted himself to this church," she said, 40 years. The Ledger, especially. I've heard he kept it beautifully." Something moved in Nora Pemberton's grey eyes. Not grief. Something quicker than grief, and considerably more guarded. "He took great care of it," she said. Then someone else claimed her attention, and she was gone. Soon Miss Marple drank her tea and thought about the difference between a woman who misses her husband and a woman who is relieved that he's dead and must still perform the correct expressions in public, and how much energy that must require, day after day. She found Mr. Hadley on Monday. He was in his office on the High Street, which she could see from the bench outside the bakery where she'd stopped, ostensibly to rest her feet and eat a small iced bun, actually to observe who went in and came out of the solicitor's door. He emerged just after 11 to post a letter himself, rather than sending his clerk, which she found interesting. Solicitors who use the post box on the corner instead of the post office on the High Street are usually avoiding a conversation with the postmistress. She intercepted him on his way back. "Mr. Hadley, I wonder if I might have a moment." He was a large man, not fat precisely, but substantial, with a face that had been ruddy for so many years that it had forgotten how to look any other way. He blinked at her with the expression of a man who has been stopped by someone's grandmother and cannot immediately place her. She explained who she was. A friend of Mrs. Bantry's, visiting for a fortnight. She had a small matter she'd been meaning to look into. A relative, possibly a family connection that might or might not appear in the parish records. And she understood Mr. Hadley had been in Lower Wellbury for many years, and might be able to advise her. None of this was entirely false. He was polite and slightly distracted, and said she was welcome to make an appointment at the office. And she thanked him, and said she would, and they parted. But she'd wanted to see his face when she mentioned the parish records. She'd gotten what she'd come for, which was the look. A look that wasn't surprise exactly, but was a kind of careful attention. The way a man looks when something touches a bruise he thought was hidden. She walked back to the bench and finished her bun. He knew about the erasures. She was fairly sure of it. Whether he'd been told by Reverend Cloak, or had heard it through the ordinary village machinery of Mrs. Garvey and the Poole sisters, she couldn't say. But he knew, and it was sitting on him uneasily, which meant it had something to do with him. Which meant that whatever Pemberton had recorded in that ledger, and whatever someone had removed, was not entirely gone from the world. Records weren't kept only in churches. Tuesday, she had tea with the Poole sisters, and she had engineered this encounter with the mild efficiency she brought to such things. A comment to Dolly, who mentioned it to the elder Miss Poole, who appeared at the farm on Tuesday afternoon with her sister and an excellent fruitcake, and the entirely genuine pleasure of having a new audience for information she'd been sitting on for years. She learned several things. Ellen Roach, the woman who had drowned in 1952, had not, in fact, been a widow. She had been, as far as the village knew at the time, unmarried. The younger Miss Poole remembered her clearly. A quiet woman, dark-haired, who'd rented a room above the bakery and worked at the farm on the Minton Road for about 18 months before she died. She'd been liked, in a general way. She'd kept to herself. There was some talk, the younger Miss Poole said, with the particular satisfaction of someone reaching the important part of a story, that she wasn't as alone as all that. Talk of what kind? Miss Marple asked. Well? The elder Miss Poole accepted more tea. There were people who thought she'd been seeing someone, married someone, and that when she turned up dead in the mill pond in December, the coincidence of the timing was, well, people did wonder. And nothing came of the wondering. Nothing. The inquest said accidental death. Inspector at the time was a man called Groves, who'd been planning to retire and did, the following March. And there it sat. Miss Marple nodded slowly. She was thinking about the timing again. 1952, when the verger was still Fitch. Fitch, who died in 1956, Pemberton, who took over in 1958. If there had been a record of Ellen Roach in the ledger, a baptism perhaps or something else, Pemberton had not erased it immediately. He'd waited. Or he'd learned something gradually, the way a man learns things when a village trusts him with its paperwork. The man she was supposedly seeing, Miss Marple said as though it were a very minor point, did anyone have a name? The Poole sisters exchanged a look. The elder one took a small breath. There was a name, she said, but it was never proven. And the family is still here, and I wouldn't like to— Of course, Miss Marple said. I quite understand. She didn't press it. The name would come. It usually did, once you'd established that you weren't going to do anything reckless with it. She picked up her knitting and let the conversation drift back to the fruitcake, which was genuinely very good, and to the summer fete, and to whether Reverend Cloak was settling in, and to a dozen other things that had nothing to do with a woman who had drowned in a mill pond 70 years ago, and whose name someone had taken the trouble to remove from the record, as though she'd never been christened at all. On her way back up the lane, she passed the village hall. She stopped at the door because it was open, and there was a child inside, a girl of about 7, pinning something to the large corkboard near the entrance. The corkboard was used for notices and announcements and, at the lower end, where small hands could reach, for children's drawings from the primary school 2 streets over. The girl finished her pinning and left without noticing Miss Marple. And Miss Marple stepped inside and looked at what had been put up. It was a drawing in crayon, the kind children make with the careful inaccuracy of the very young. A house, a garden, 5 figures standing in a row, 2 tall ones, 3 smaller ones, each with a round yellow head, and stick arms raised in what was probably joy. Across the bottom, in a teacher's neat hand, My Family, by Lily Fowler, age 7. Miss Marple looked at it for a long moment. She had heard only last week from the Poole sisters that the Fowlers had 3 children. Mr. Hadley was found on Thursday morning. His housekeeper, a Mrs. Trott who came in at 8:30 every weekday to make his breakfast and sort his post, who found him at his desk in the inner office with his head resting on his forearms, in an attitude that might have been sleep, except that he was cold, and had been cold for some hours. She called the police from the office telephone rather than walking to the post office, which meant Mrs. Garvey didn't know about it until nearly 10, which was, for Lower Wellbury, a remarkable delay. Inspector Devereux came down from Mincham, which was the nearest town with a proper police station. He was a competent man in his 50s, who had the look of someone who had dealt with a great many things over the years, and had learned which ones warranted urgency. He walked through Hadley's office carefully, asked Mrs. Trott several questions, spoke briefly with the clerk who had arrived for work to find the building taped off, and by noon had formed the opinion that Mr. Hadley had died of a heart attack sometime between 9 and 11 the previous evening. This was not an unreasonable opinion. Hadley had been under the care of a doctor in Mincham for angina for 3 years. He was overweight, and he worked long hours, and he had the complexion of a man who does not take advice about wine. The doctor confirmed all of this when reached by telephone. There were no marks on the body. The office was not disturbed. The front door had been locked from the inside with Hadley's own key, which was still in the lock. Devereux filed it as natural causes pending the post-mortem and drove back to Mincham. Dolly heard about it from the younger Miss Poole, who'd heard it from the butcher's boy, who'd been making a delivery 2 doors down when Mrs. and Trott came out of the building. By the time it reached Dolly, it was lunchtime, and Miss Marple was in the garden pretending to appreciate the late dahlias and actually thinking about the Fowler family. "Hadley's dead," Dolly said from the doorway. Miss Marple turned. "When?" "Last night, they think. His housekeeper found him this morning. Heart, apparently." Miss Marple came inside. She sat at the kitchen table and accepted the cup of tea Dolly made without being asked, and she was quiet for long enough that Dolly, who knew her, didn't fill the silence. "The post-mortem," Miss Marple said at last. "Will they do one?" "I should think so, wouldn't they? Unexpected death." "Yes," a pause. "Though unexpected isn't always the word they use." Dolly looked at her. "Jane, do you think it wasn't his heart?" Miss Marple wrapped both hands around her cup. Outside, the dahlias she'd been pretending to look at moved slightly in the wind, their heavy heads tilting. She thought about Hadley's face on Monday morning when she'd mentioned the parish records. The look that wasn't quite surprise. "I think," she said, "that I'd very much like to see his office."
Hello again, my friends. It brings me no joy to tell you that our fears were justified. The web of blackmail in Lower Wellbury has claimed another victim. At our stage of life, we know that a failing heart is a common visitor. But an undisturbed room and a locked door can be a clever stage play. I was in Dolly's garden looking at the late dahlias when she brought me the news. Mr. Hadley had managed the Verger's financial affairs. He knew about the blackmail money. I realised I could not sit by the fire while a murderer cleaned up their mistakes. What I found in that office was a smell from the past and a clue that pointed to a child's innocent drawing.
She managed it on Friday afternoon. Reverend Cloak, it turned out, was the one who'd been asked to retrieve a file from Hadley's office, something relating to the church's property lease that couldn't wait, and he'd mentioned this at the Wednesday morning service that Miss Marple attended on the grounds that she had enjoyed Sunday's sermon and wondered if the weekday ones were different in character. They were not particularly, but Reverend Cloak was grateful for the attendance and entirely willing to let her accompany him to the office on Friday if she'd like. as she'd expressed such an interest in the village's records generally. The clerk let them in. He was a young man called Willis, who was still somewhat pale from Thursday's events, and who seemed glad of the company. The inner office was as Mrs. Trott had left it, more or less, pending whatever further examination Devereux decided to conduct. The desk was large and leather-topped, and faced the window that looked onto the small rear garden. There was a blotter, an inkstand, a telephone, 2 stacks of files, a wastepaper basket, a coat stand in the corner with Hadley's overcoat still on it, which gave the room an uncomfortable feeling, as though he'd just stepped out. Miss Marple moved through it slowly, looking at things without touching them. Reverend Cloak found his file in a cabinet near the door. Willis hovered. The fountain pen was on the floor beside the desk, not on it. She noticed it because it had rolled against the brass foot of the desk leg and stopped there, and the ink had run from the nib slightly onto the parquet. A small black stain not quite circular. Was Mr. Hadley left-handed? She asked Willis. Willis blinked. Right-handed, I think. I never... Yes, right-handed. Why? She looked at the desk. Hadley's chair had been on the right side of the desk, the telephone on the right, the inkstand on the right. The pen had been found on the left side of the chair, near the left desk leg. A right-handed man who drops a pen while working drops it to the right and slightly forward, or it rolls right. It doesn't generally end up behind the left leg. She didn't say any of this. She said, I only wondered. It's the sort of thing one notices. The other thing she noticed was the smell. It was faint enough that you might not register it at all if you walked through quickly, or if you had a cold, or if you simply weren't looking for it. Something chemical and slightly sweet beneath the ordinary smells of the office. Dust, old paper, the coal fire that had burned down overnight. It reminded her, distantly, of something she couldn't immediately place. Not ink, not cleaning fluid. Something older. Something from before the war, possibly, or just after it, when certain products had been common that weren't common now. She stood at the window for a moment, looking at the garden. There was a smear of ink on Hadley's desk blotter, a right-hand side, consistent with someone writing. There was also a faint smear on the arm of the chair, the right arm, and on what would have been his left cuff if he'd been sitting and had reached across his body. She hadn't touched anything, but she'd looked closely, and the smear on the chair arm had a quality different from ordinary ink. It was slightly paler, as though something had been done to it. Diluted or interfered with. She filed it. Willis walked them out. On the pavement outside, she paused and looked up at the building's face. Then she looked down the high street toward the post office, and then at Hartwells on the corner, and then at the churchyard wall, just visible at the bottom of the lane. Reverend Cloak, she said, the 6 names that were erased. Was one of them a Fowler? He looked at her with the expression she was getting used to, slightly startled, trying to work out how she knew things. Yes, one of them was a Fowler entry. A birth record, 1978. Why? Do you know the family? Only a little, by reputation. She pulled her coat closer. The wind off the fields had a real edge to it now, the kind that belongs to the back end of October rather than the beginning. The child's drawing in the village hall, the one that says my family, Lily Fowler. Have you seen it? I don't think I have, no. 5 figures, she said. There are 5. I thought it might be worth mentioning. He looked uncertain about what to do with this. She didn't elaborate. She thanked him for the access to the office and walked back toward the high street, leaving him on the pavement looking after her, with the slightly dazed expression of someone who has just been handed a piece of information and told to hold it for now, the Fowlers. She worked through what she knew on the walk back. Thomas Fowler ran the dairy farm on the Minton Road, which was the same farm where Ellen Roach had worked in 1950 and 1951. He was 48, according to the Poole sisters. His wife, Barbara, was a year younger. They had 3 children, 2 boys and the girl, Lily, the youngest. But Lily had drawn 5 people. Children drew their families with a simple accuracy that adults sometimes found inconvenient. They put in the people who were there. A family of 5 was a family of 5, 3 children present. 1 more accounted for, presumably, a birth entry in the ledger from 1978, erased. And that was 4 children. The 5th figure in the drawing was one of the adults, which left 4 children and 2 parents, which was 6 figures, and Lily had drawn 5. Miss Marple stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the pavement outside the bakery and thought it through again. Or the drawing wasn't about the present at all. Children sometimes drew families that included people who were gone. A sibling who had died, perhaps, or someone else. Someone the adults referred to in certain unguarded moments, and the child had absorbed without being told the full meaning. She looked up. She was standing directly outside the bakery window. Inside, behind the counter, the baker's wife was wrapping something in paper and talking to a customer with the easy fluency of someone conducting 2 activities simultaneously. Perfectly ordinary. Miss Marple went in and bought a small loaf she didn't need, and came out and walked back toward the farm. She asked Dolly about the Fowlers that evening. Dolly thought about it. Thomas Fowler I know slightly. He delivered milk here for years before he switched to the depot. Solid man. His wife Barbara is on the flower rota. I've met her at church. She's friendly, but a bit reserved. Why? The birth entry that was erased from the ledger. 1978. Reverend Cloak confirmed it was a Fowler entry. Dolly sat up straighter. A child they haven't spoken about? Or someone connected to the family. I may be wrong. She picked up her knitting. The grey cardigan she'd been working on since the first night, still unfinished. It may be nothing more than a child's imagination in a drawing. 7-year-olds add figures sometimes, but you don't think so. I think, Miss Marple said, that the erased names are not random. Someone chose them deliberately. And the question isn't only who made the erasures, but what connects those 6 entries to each other, because that connection is the shape of the whole thing. She thought about the smell in Hadley's office again. It had come to her on the walk back, finally surfacing from wherever it had been sitting. It was the smell of a particular ink remover she had used herself years ago, a product called Oblitex or something very like it that had been sold at chemists in the late 1940s and through the 1950s. She'd used it for correspondence, for the small errors one made in ink before the days of easier correction. She hadn't seen a bottle of it in at least 15 years, and it had been discontinued. She was almost sure of that. It had caused some sort of damage to certain papers, and the manufacturer had withdrawn it. And people had grumbled and switched to other products, and that had been that. If someone in Lower Wellbury still had a bottle, had kept it or found it or purchased it in bulk at some point before it disappeared from the shelves, that was a very small pool of possibilities. And if that same substance had been used both on the parish ledger and on something connected to Hadley's office, Then the pool was smaller still. One person, one bottle, one reason. She set down her knitting and looked at the fire.
Good day to you. There is a singular satisfaction when the scattered pieces of a puzzle finally lock together. Reverend Cloak confirmed that the erased birth entry from 1978 belonged to the Fowler family, a child that the village records had been manipulated to forget. Adults are so terribly clever at lying, aren't we? But children draw the world exactly as they feel it. When I told dear Dolly about the erased Fowler child, she sat up so straight I thought she might injure her back. I told Dolly that the erased names were not random. A child born of an affair, perhaps. And then the final piece fell into place. The strange, sweet chemical smell in Mr. Hadley's office. The same discontinued chemical used to erase the ledger was used in the solicitor's office the night he died. One person. I knew there could only be a few drops of that poison left in the village.
"I'd like to visit Hartwells tomorrow," she said, "for wool." Dolly, to her credit, didn't ask why she needed more wool. She just said she'd come too, if Miss Marple didn't mind the company. A Hartwells smelled of cedar and old wood and something faintly waxy that Miss Marple associated with the particular kind of English shop that has been in one location long enough to develop its own atmosphere. The floor was uneven in places. The shelves ran from floor to ceiling and held wool, ribbon button cards, small household sundries, and at the far end a section of cleaning and household products that had the air of being there mostly out of habit. Gerald Hartwell was the fourth generation to run the shop. He was 62, lean with the careful manner of a man who had spent his life listening to what people actually wanted, rather than what they said they wanted, which was a considerable professional skill. And also, Miss Marple suspected, an occupational hazard when it came to keeping other people's confidences. She bought 2 skeins of grey wool she didn't strictly need, and a card of buttons for a coat she had at home that had been missing one button for 3 years, and would probably continue to miss it. And then she drifted toward the household products end of the shelf, while Dolly asked about ribbon. The shelf held the usual things: bleach, a general-purpose cleaner, something for brass, something for silver, a stain remover in a red bottle. She looked at all of them with the mild attention of someone who is simply browsing. Then she turned to Gerald Hartwell. "I wonder," she said, "whether you still carry a product called Oblitex, or something similar. It was an ink remover, quite effective. I used to buy it years ago." Hartwell looked at the shelf automatically, though he clearly already knew the answer. "No, we haven't had that for, it must be 15 years now, possibly longer. It was discontinued. Caused some sort of problem with certain papers, I believe. We had complaints, in fact, people using it on documents and finding it left a residue." "Oh dear, a pity. I'd been hoping." "We do carry ink away, if that helps. Different formulation. Quite good." She looked at the ink away bottle and thanked him and said she'd think about it. Then, as though it had just occurred to her, "I don't suppose anyone has asked after it recently? An old customer, perhaps, who hadn't heard it was discontinued?" It was a transparent question. She knew that, and so did Hartwell, she suspected, after a moment. He was too polite to say so. "Not recently, no." He paused just long enough for her to note the pause. Some time ago someone did ask. 4 or 5 weeks back, I'd say. Before Mr. Pemberton passed. I told them the same as I've told you." "Of course," she smiled at him. "Thank you, Gerald." She carried her wool to the counter and paid for it. Dolly finished with the ribbon. They went out into the grey Saturday morning and walked a little way up the street before Miss Marple said anything. "He wouldn't tell me who asked," she said. No, Dolly agreed. He wouldn't, would he? But someone inquired after it 4 or 5 weeks ago and was told it was no longer available. Which means whoever used it on the ledger already had a supply. The inquiry was possibly to confirm the bottle they had was the only one, or to see whether anyone else had recently purchased it. Dolly was quiet for a moment. Can you actually work out who it was from that? Not from that alone, but it narrows things considerably. She stopped at the corner. The churchyard wall was visible from here, and beyond it the upper edge of the mill pond, flat and grey under the October sky. Gerald Hartwell was Verger's warden for 6 years before Mr. Fitch died. He would have known Pemberton well. He would also know, in the way that people who have run a shop in one village for their entire lives know things, a great deal about who has what in their cupboards. You think he knows whose bottle it is. I think he has a very good idea. And I think he told me what he could without telling me what he couldn't. She went to church on Sunday again. Nora Pemberton was there, in the same pew, in the same black. The brooch was at her collar again, the blue stones, and the silver setting. Miss Marple sat 3 rows back and looked at it during the first hymn and thought about things. The brooch was not new. That was the thing she kept coming back to. It had the particular patina of something worn regularly for years, rather than something recently acquired. A faint softening of the silver at the clasp, a tiny scratch on one of the lower stones. Nora had owned it for a long time. She wore it as though she'd always worn it, with the unconscious ease of an object so familiar it had ceased to be a decision. A verger's wife who had owned a piece of jewellery like that for 20 years at least. Miss Marple thought about what a verger might know. Pemberton had held the ledger for 40 years. The ledger recorded every baptism, marriage and burial in the parish, which meant it recorded, if you knew how to read it, a great deal about who had been born to whom, and when and under what circumstances. A child born 6 months after a marriage, a burial with no family in attendance, an entry with a different surname than the others in the family. None of it was secret in itself, but all of it could become secret if the person reading it understood what it meant and understood that someone else would pay to keep it unremarked. Pemberton had been patient, that was the word again. He had sat in that vestry for 40 years with his careful small handwriting and his oilcloth and his knowledge, and he had collected. Not aggressively, not in the way of a man who makes demands and creates scenes. In the quiet, steady way of someone who simply makes clear now and then that he knows something, and that knowing it carries certain ongoing costs, and that the costs are really quite reasonable, and that the alternative would be so much more unpleasant for everyone. The brooch was 20 years of payments, more or less, in various forms. The brooch was the part that had survived. She wondered how many other small signs there were in the village, how many small luxuries, how many unexplained kindnesses from Pemberton, how many things that the village had simply accepted because they'd always been that way. After the service, she walked to the mill pond. She did this alone, telling Dolly she wanted the air and the walk, and that she'd be back in an hour. The fog had stayed away for 3 days now, but the sky was the colour of old pewter, and the trees along the lane had mostly given up on their leaves, which lay in damp layers along the verges. She stood at the far bank this time, the side with no fence. The ground here was soft and slightly undercut, where the water had worked at it over years. It would have been easy, on a winter evening in 1952, for someone to go in from this bank. Easy and quick and quiet, in the dark, with the village lights a long way up the hill. Whether Ellen Roach had walked here herself, or been brought here, or been helped over the edge, that was the question no inquest had properly answered. And now it was 70 years old, and would not be answerable at all. But she had been pregnant. Miss Marple was almost sure of that now. The 1978 birth entry in the ledger, the erased Fowler entry, was not a child born to Thomas and Barbara Fowler, who had been married in 1974, and whose family was otherwise accounted for. It was, she suspected, a child born to Thomas Fowler, and a woman who was not Barbara, and the child had been adopted, or absorbed, or simply raised as one of the family, and the record of the birth had been in the ledger, and Pemberton had known about it and had been quietly collecting on that knowledge for years. That was one thread. Ellen Roach in 1952 was another, older thread, and she didn't yet know exactly how it connected. But it connected. Someone had wanted that name out of the record badly enough to use a bottle of Oblitex that they'd been holding on to for 15 years. Which meant the name had meant something to someone who was still alive and still in Lower Wellbury and still frightened of it. She turned away from the mill pond and walked back up the lane. She found Nora Pemberton at home. She hadn't intended to go to the house, not yet, not today, but she passed it on the way back from the mill pond, and the curtain in the front room moved, and then the door opened before she'd decided anything, and Nora Pemberton was standing in the doorway with an expression that was not quite surprise. "Miss Marple," she said, "would you like to come in?" The house was comfortable and slightly airless, in the way of houses whose windows are kept shut against the autumn. There were photographs on the mantelpiece and a coal fire that had been burning for some hours, and a smell of beeswax polish. The furniture was better than you'd expect. Not noticeably so, not obviously so, but the chairs were good quality, and the carpet was not cheap, and there were small things here and there that added up to a household that had more money coming in than a verger's salary could explain. Nora made tea without asking whether she wanted any. They sat across from each other, the fire between them. Miss Marple looked at the photographs on the mantelpiece. Pemberton at various ages. A wedding photograph, 1963. No children, she noted. The Pembertons had not had children. "You've been asking about Aubrey?" Nora said. It was not quite an accusation. "I've been curious about the ledger," Miss Marple said. "About the erasures." Nora's hands were around her cup. She had good hands, still capable looking, the hands of a woman who had worked hard her whole life. The brooch was at her collar. Up close, it was very fine. Oh, the stones a deep blue that reminded Miss Marple of a colour she'd seen somewhere recently and couldn't immediately place. "He wasn't a bad man," Nora said. "People are going to say he was. I know that." Miss Marple said nothing. He saw things. He was always there, wasn't he? Always in the vestry, always with the ledger. People forgot he could read, not just the letters, but what the letters meant. She looked at the fire. He never threatened anyone. He never said anything ugly. He just made it known that he knew. And people made their own arrangements. For 40 years, Miss Marple said. Nora's jaw moved slightly. For 40 years. And you knew. A long pause. The fire shifted, settling. "I knew," she said. "Not at first, not for the first few years, but yes, I knew." She looked up, and her grey eyes were steady and not apologetic. "And before you ask, yes, I was ashamed. I am ashamed. But there was nothing to be done about it by then. It had already happened, and it couldn't be unhappened, and he was my husband." Miss Marple looked at her. She thought about St. Mary Mead again, about a woman called Mrs. Philpot, who had discovered her husband's deceptions so late in the marriage that unpicking them would have been indistinguishable from unpicking herself. She had understood Mrs. Philpot. She understood Nora Pemberton. Understanding was not the same as exoneration. "The bottle of Oblitex," she said. "In the house, is it?" Nora set down her cup. Her hands were not quite steady. "I don't know what you mean," she said. Miss Marple looked at her for a long moment. "Yes, you do," she said, not unkindly, and she didn't go to Devereux immediately. She went home first, back to Dolly's farmhouse, back to the kitchen table and the grey cardigan and a cup of tea that she let go cold while she sat and thought it through from the beginning. Dolly left her to it. She'd learned over the years that Miss Marple's silences were not empty, and that interrupting them was like interrupting a calculation halfway through. Outside the kitchen window, the dahlias were finally done. They'd been holding on through October with a stubbornness that Miss Marple found slightly admirable, but the frost 2 nights ago had finished them, and they hung now in a way that was simply sad rather than dramatically so. Oh, she thought about Pemberton, about the shape of a life built on other people's fear. It had been, she suspected, entirely ordinary from the inside, and he had gone to church every Sunday, and wound the clock in the vestry, and topped up the flower vases, and made himself indispensable. And in between all of that, he had quietly maintained a network of knowledge that kept his household comfortable, and his wife in better jewellery than a verger's salary warranted. He had not been violent. He had not made scenes. He had simply known things, and made clear that he knew them, and waited for people to do the arithmetic. 40 years of that. And then a new vicar had arrived. Young, conscientious, the sort who actually read the ledger rather than treating it as furniture. And Pemberton, who was 79 and not as sharp as he'd been, had perhaps grown careless in some way she didn't fully know. Or perhaps Reverend Cloak had simply asked him a question he hadn't been prepared for. Something had shifted. Something had made the ledger feel dangerous in a way it hadn't felt before. So someone had decided to end it. Not the blackmail. Pemberton himself. The difficulty was that his death had been ruled natural causes. She turned this over carefully. He was 79. He had died in his sleep. There was no mark on him, no obvious disturbance, nothing the doctor had found cause to question. A heart that had been working for 79 years had simply stopped, which hearts did. But hearts could be helped to stop. Certain substances, administered carefully in the right amount, produced exactly that result in an elderly man with an existing cardiac history. Substances that left very little trace if the examining doctor wasn't specifically looking for them, or wasn't specifically looking because there was no particular reason to look. This was not theoretical knowledge. It was the kind of knowledge that anyone sufficiently determined and sufficiently frightened could acquire, if they had time and access to the right books, or the right person. She thought about the chemical smell in Hadley's office. That was the part that had been nagging at her since Friday. And it nagged still. The Oblitex smell. It didn't belong in a solicitor's office in the normal course of things. It belonged in the vestry, or in Nora Pemberton's kitchen cupboard, or somewhere else entirely, and its presence in Hadley's office on the evening he died needed explaining. Hadley had been Pemberton's solicitor, not just in a general sense. She'd established that, confirmed it through the Poole sisters on Tuesday, who knew everything, that Hadley had handled Pemberton's affairs for 30 years, which almost certainly meant he'd handled the financial arrangements that the blackmail produced. The payments that came in regularly from people who could not afford to have their secrets aired. A solicitor didn't need to know the nature of an arrangement to manage the paperwork around it. But he would have known enough. Enough to be useful, and enough to be dangerous once Pemberton was gone, and someone began looking at the ledger. He'd had to go too, the ink remover smell in his office. She'd been turning this over and had arrived at the only explanation that fit. Someone had come to Hadley's office that Tuesday evening, had spoken to him privately, and in the course of whatever happened, had used Oblitex on something. A document, perhaps. A letter or record that Hadley had kept, and that could not be allowed to survive. And Hadley had died, and the death had been made to look like what it almost could have been anyway, and the document was gone. One person, one bottle, one very long, very patient plan coming apart at the edges, because a young vicar had tilted a ledger toward the light. She went to see Devereux on Monday morning. She'd telephoned ahead, which he'd clearly found slightly surprising. A request from an elderly visitor to speak with him privately about the Hadley death, which he'd closed. He received her in his office in Mincham, with the careful politeness of a man who is not sure how seriously to take something, and has decided to err on the side of courtesy while he works it out. She was concise. She'd found over the years, and that being concise with policemen was more effective than being thorough. You gave them the shape of the thing and let them see the logic for themselves, because logic they'd arrived at themselves was always more convincing than logic handed to them fully assembled. She told him about the Oblitex, about the smell in Hadley's office and what it suggested, about the fact that the product had been discontinued 15 years ago, and that Gerald Hartwell had confirmed, without quite saying so, that someone in the village had recently inquired after it, meaning confirmed its scarcity, 4 or 5 weeks before Pemberton's death. She told him that Pemberton's death warranted a second look. Not an assumption of murder, a look. She told him about the ledger erasures, which he'd known about vaguely but hadn't connected to the deaths, and she told him about Hadley's role in Pemberton's financial arrangements, and what that would have meant once the scrutiny began. She did not tell him about Nora Pemberton directly. Not yet. What she said was, the person who did this had access to a bottle of Oblitex, which is effectively unique. They had knowledge of the ledger's contents, which limits the field considerably. And they had sufficient intimacy with both Pemberton and Hadley to act without arousing suspicion. I think when you look for the bottle, you'll find it. And I think where you find it will answer the rest of your questions. Devereux looked at her for a long moment. You know who it is, he said. I have a strong view, Miss Marple said. But a strong view isn't evidence. The bottle is evidence. He got the search warrant by Wednesday. The bottle was in the back of the cupboard under the kitchen sink at Nora Pemberton's house, behind a tin of beeswax polish and a box of rubber gloves that hadn't been opened. It was a small brown glass bottle with a paper label that had gone yellow and soft at the edges, and it was a third full. Oblitex ink remover. Manufactured by Henley and Briggs Limited, London. The manufacturer's address on the label was an address that no longer existed because the building had been demolished in 1971. The post-mortem on Pemberton, conducted for the second time with specific direction, found traces of a compound consistent with digoxin toxicity. Not prescribed to him. Not found in his medicine cabinet. Administered, the pathologist believed, in something he'd eaten or drunk on the evening of his death. Something that had metabolized thoroughly enough that the first examination had found nothing wrong with a 79-year-old heart that had simply, apparently, stopped. Hadley's post-mortem was reopened. The same compound, a different dose, larger. Hadley had been heavier, and the calculation had needed to account for that. Nora Pemberton was arrested on Thursday afternoon. Miss Marple was not there for that part. She was at Dolly's, by the window, knitting. The grey cardigan was nearly done. She'd noticed only that morning that she'd somehow been calling it grey for 2 weeks, when it was plainly blue, a fact she could not account for, and which had made Dolly laugh more than the situation warranted. She was on the last sleeve now, working steadily, with the needles clicking in the quiet of the afternoon. Dolly came in from the garden and stood in the doorway. "They've taken her." Miss Marple nodded. She didn't look up. "Did you know," Dolly said, "when you had tea with her? On Saturday?" A pause, a few more stitches. "I was fairly sure," Miss Marple said. She'd lived alongside it for so long. 40 years of knowing what he was and saying nothing, and then he became a liability rather than a husband, and the new vicar arrived. And I think she told herself she was protecting people. The ones he'd been bleeding. She may even have believed it. But she was also protecting herself. She'd known for 40 years. She'd accepted the money and the brooch and the better furniture, and she had not said a word to anyone. And when the ledger became dangerous, she acted, I think, partly from some genuine desire to end what he'd been doing, and partly from the very straightforward fear of what she'd be facing if it all came out. Dolly was quiet for a moment. And Hadley? Hadley was loose thread. He'd have talked eventually. He wasn't a brave man, and he wouldn't have gone to prison for a dead blackmailer. Miss Marple set down her needles. She was thorough. She'd been thinking about it for some time. The digoxin, the Oblitex, the erasures. She went to the trouble of inquiring after a fresh supply of the ink remover so she'd know whether anyone else had it, which suggests she'd been planning carefully for weeks, possibly longer. She looked out the window. The mill pond wasn't visible from here, but she knew it was there, at the bottom of the lane, flat and grey and still. "Ellen Roach," she said. "I wonder if we'll ever know exactly what happened there." "Do you think Pemberton was involved?" "I think a young woman came to Lower Wellbury in 1950 carrying someone else's secret and worked at the Fowler farm, and drowned in the mill pond in December 1952. I think Fitch was verger then, and may have known something, and that when Pemberton inherited the ledger, he inherited whatever Fitch had written down. And I think the Fowler entry from 1978, the erased birth, was connected to that old story in a way I don't fully know, and probably never will." She picked up her needles again. The child who was born in 1978 is in his 40s now. He may not know. He may not need to. Dolly sat down across from her. Outside, a car passed on the lane, and a dog barked twice and was quiet. "You don't seem pleased," Dolly said. "Usually you're. I know." Miss Marple turned the cardigan on her needles. "Usually there's a certain satisfaction in it, the shape of it coming clear. But this one is all sadness, isn't it? Pemberton spent 40 years making people afraid, and Nora spent 40 years pretending not to know. And 2 people are dead. And whatever happened to Ellen Roach in 1952 will stay murky, and the village will talk about it for years. In that way villages do, half fact and half invention, and that's really all there is. She thought about the child's drawing in the village hall. 5 figures with yellow heads and stick arms raised. She wondered whether Lily Fowler's drawing had been taken down yet, or whether it was still pinned to the corkboard, cheerful and oblivious, or while the adults around it dealt with the consequences of things that had happened before she was born. "I keep thinking about Tot," she said. Dolly looked blank. "Who?" "A gardener in St. Mary Mead, years ago. He kept a little book. Everyone thought he was vague and harmless and thoroughly unremarkable, and he had been quietly collecting their worst moments for 20 years. She shook her head. "I should have known when Reverend Cloak mentioned the erasures. I did know, I think. I just hoped I was wrong." She wasn't often wrong about these things. That was not she had found as comforting as it sounded. She left Lower Wellbury on Saturday. David, her nephew, came to collect her in his sensible car and loaded her bag and her considerably larger quantity of wool into the boot without comment, which she appreciated. Dolly walked her out, and they stood in the farmyard for a moment in the thin autumn sun, the fields flat and brown on both sides of the lane, the church tower visible above the tree line, the mill pond somewhere beyond it, out of sight. "Same time next year," Dolly said, "if you'll have me. Jane." Dolly looked at her. "I always will." Miss Marple patted her hand and got into the car. They drove out through the village, past the post office, past Hartwells, past the solicitor's brass plate that still said Hadley and Sons, and now said only what it had always said, which was that time moves at its own pace and waits for no one to update the signage. Past the lane that led down to the mill pond. Past St. Edmund's, where the vestry window caught the morning light and threw it back briefly, bright and indifferent. And then the village was behind them, and the road opened up, and there was nothing but fields and the grey sky and the easy silence of 2 people who don't need to fill it. Miss Marple looked out the window. She thought for a moment about the ledger, about the indentations in the paper where names had been, the ghost of ink, the physical memory of people the village had tried to forget. You couldn't really erase anything, she thought, not completely. The paper remembered, even when the ink was gone. Then she turned to David and asked about his mother, and the village fell away behind them like fog in the morning. And that was that. End.